Welcome back to the presentation on nutrition for synchronized skating. This is part 2 of the video.
Similar to the protein foods, there are also more optimal carbohydrates that you can be having. So the nutrient-dense carbohydrates are foods that also contain other beneficial nutrients that are going to have a positive impact on your health. So that could be things like vitamins, minerals, extra protein, fiber, or antioxidants. So the best example of these would be your fruits, vegetables, breads, cereals, and grains, especially whole grain or wholemeal varieties. Your legumes, so things like chickpeas and lentils, and your dairy products will also naturally contain a little bit of carbohydrate because milk contains a sugar called lactose, and so that contributes to the carbohydrate content of dairy products such as milk and yogurt. So the nutrient-dense carbohydrates should make up approximately 80 to 90% of your daily diet. So the way I like to think of it is if you're in an off-season or you don't have a competition coming up too soon, or maybe you're trying to gain a little bit of muscle mass, you might stick more so to the 80% daily diet made up of nutrient-dense carbohydrates. And then when you're preparing for a competition or trying to maybe maintain your body composition, you might aim for more like 90% of your diet coming from those nutrient-dense carbohydrates. The other type of carbohydrates are your nutrient-poor carbohydrates, and the reason that they're nutrient-poor is that they don't contain any other beneficial nutrients and tend to be made up mostly of sugar. So that looks like foods like and drinks like energy drinks, lollies, chocolate, cakes, carbohydrate drinks, so things like Powerade and Gatorade, sports gels, cordial, and honey or jam. And so that should make up a minimal proportion of your diet. They don't have to be excluded completely, but you might have them as an occasional treat a bit more often when you aren't preparing for a competition, and a little bit less often when you have a competition that's coming up soon. So about 10 to 20% of your daily diet should be, or no more than that, should be made up of the nutrient-poor carbohydrates. Fat is the last one to talk about, the last macronutrient to talk about, and it's actually kind of forgotten by athletes especially. They tend to focus on protein and carbohydrates because it impacts performance most, but fat is actually very important for a lot of your internal processes. So firstly, it provides protection and insulation for your organs. So if you have an extremely low body fat percentage, anywhere less than 5 to 10% body fat, your organs can start to malfunction. The fat in your food is also really important for helping you absorb fat-soluble vitamins. So there are some vitamins that can't be used unless there is a fat source in your meal. So those are vitamins A, D, E, and K. Fat can help to assist with concentration. So for example, during a school day or work day, and that's because they're a very slow release source of energy. So when you consume a higher fat meal, it's digested much more slowly than a high carbohydrate meal, and so it gives you a much more prolonged source of energy throughout the day. Fats can also help with satiety, so helping to keep you feeling full. And for girls in particular, a healthy body fat percentage is needed for menstruation to occur. So a lot of the time I'll see in my clinic that girls who have a very low body fat percentage will lose their period. And so while that might seem like a good thing, it's actually not ideal, because your period and the hormones that are produced during your period actually help to maintain your bone density. And so when you lose your period, when you lose it for a long time, your bone mineral density starts to decline, and that puts you at more risk of things like bone breaks and fractures. So there's two key messages to take away from this. One is the time of day that you would eat your fatty foods, and the second is the type of fat that you choose to consume. So the time of day that you should consume higher fat foods should be more so away from your training sessions. So as I said, fat is digested quite slowly, and so if you're having something higher fat before your training session, it can make you feel a bit sick or a bit sluggish during your training session because it'll take much longer to digest than something that's higher in carbohydrates. So if you're training in the afternoon, for example, your breakfast, morning tea, and lunch might be foods that contain a little bit more fat. And then towards the end of the day, before and after your training session, you might reduce your fat intake slightly. The other important thing is the type of fat that you're consuming. So making sure to make the most of your fat sources unsaturated fats, and generally unsaturated fats come from plant foods, so that would be things like avocados, nuts, seeds, and olive oil, and you also get quite a bit from fatty fish, so that's the exception to the rule. Fatty fish like salmon and tuna will have quite a high amount of your unsaturated fats, especially omega-3. What you want to try and reduce or limit is your saturated fat intake. And so you don't have to cut it out completely, but it's best to try to minimize it where you can. So your saturated fats will come from animal foods besides the salmon and tuna. And you also get quite a bit of saturated fat from coconut and coconut oil. And so when I say it's best to reduce your intake of saturated fat, it doesn't mean you have to cut out meat completely, but rather than choosing a piece of steak that has a big portion of fat surrounding the outside of it, you might choose a leaner cut of steak and then choose to cook it in some olive oil, so you're having the correct type of fat as well as the saturated fat in the meal. So putting all that information together, you might be wondering how we can find that balance between getting enough of the nutrients in to maintain performance and maintain good health without overfueling and increasing your body fat percentage too much. And so there are three key principles that I like to use to be able to maintain body composition while maintaining optimal performance and not compromising on your nutrient and micronutrient intake. So first one would be nutrient timing. Second would be creating balanced meals. And the third would be having a good mindset around food and nutrition. So we'll go into each of those in a bit more detail. So first up is nutrient timing, and so I've given you hints of what this might look like throughout the presentation already, but I think this graph shows it really nicely. So let's take the example again of training in the afternoon. So let's say your training session is at 6 p.m. The way that you should time your nutrients throughout the day should reflect the time of your training session. So at the start of the day, when you're less active and maybe you're studying or at work, sitting around mostly, you don't really need much carbohydrate to fuel you because you're not doing much physical work. So the carbohydrate should directly reflect how much exercise or how much physical activity you're doing at a particular time of the day. So your carbohydrate intake would start quite low in the morning, so breakfast, morning tea, lunch. Then at 4 p.m, about 2 hours before your training session, you will start to increase your carbohydrate intake, and have a much higher carbohydrate meal to fuel your training session. And then you might train until 7:30, 8 o'clock, and when you come home, you should then refuel with a higher carbohydrate meal as well. With your fat intake, it will always do the complete opposite of what your carbohydrates do. So if your carbohydrate intake was low in the morning, your fat intake should be slightly higher so that it's giving you that prolonged source of energy to help with concentration and focus, but won't contribute later on in the day to feeling sluggish or lethargic during your training session, or feeling a bit sick when you're having a higher fat meal. So the fats will start a little bit higher at breakfast, morning tea and lunch, and then pre-training and post-training you should try and minimize your fat intake to help maximize the carbohydrate uptake into your muscles and to speed up the carbohydrate uptake into your muscles. With your protein, that should stay quite consistent throughout the day. So all of your main meals should contain a good source of protein. Going back to that table with the leucine contents of each of your foods, you should try and be including at least one of those foods in every main meal. So at breakfast, lunch and dinner. At your snacks, you should try, where possible, to also include a good source of protein at morning tea and afternoon tea, and maybe even supper if you have time for it. If you don't fit some protein into one or two of those meals, that's fine. But if you can get some protein into all of your snacks, that would be even better. So timing your nutrients like this will help to maximize your performance and make sure you're not losing any strength or power, but also help to maintain your body composition. If your training session was in the morning, then the spread of nutrients would just be flipped in reverse. So if you're training in the morning, your carbohydrates would be higher in the morning and your fat intake would be lower in the morning, and then towards the end of the day, your carbohydrate intake would decrease a little bit and your fat intake would increase a little bit, while protein remains pretty much consistent.
Now for a quick break in our presentation to tell you a little bit about One Team Movement. One Team Movement is a not-for-profit organization that is working to unite and empower the synchronized skating community in order to grow the sport worldwide. Our pillars are unite, develop, promote, and support. We unite the community and encourage sportsmanship and collaboration. We create opportunities such as camps and shareable online content to help develop the sport at the grassroots level. We work to promote awareness of the sport, and we support the community with grants and giveaways. We hope you're enjoying this presentation and will consider checking out One Team Movement on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter once the presentation is finished. To view part 3 of this presentation, please click the link on the video.